Hey guys, welcome back to our devotional series from the book of Philippians. Today we're going to be looking at Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 to 18. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing right now, why don't you pause this video, go and grab a Bible, come back, and then we can read together. So having looked at imitating Christ's humility in chapter 2 verses 1 to 11, looking at joy and humility, Paul is now going to go on to talk about joy in obedience from verses 12 to 18. So we're going to read that together from verse 12. It says, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labour in vain. But even if I'm being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me." So, as I said, having looked at Christ's humility in verses 1 to 11, as we reach verse 12, we have another therefore. Now, remember that the therefore is that in light of what we've just read, there's an action, there's a call to action. And notice there's the therefore in verse 9 and in verse 12. The therefore in verse 9 is what God did as a result of Christ's humility. And the therefore in verse 12 is what we should do in response to Christ's humility, in response to imitating that humility. And so in response to imitating that humility, Paul says, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Continue to obey. In other words, in response to humbling our hearts in submission to God, we should obey him. He says, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Now let's just understand this. Paul's not talking about a works gospel. Paul is not talking about us doing works to earn our salvation. He's talking about that our kind of abiding in Christ, our works, should be as a result of our salvation. In other words, because of our joy in Christ, we want to serve him, we want to obey him. And he goes on, do everything without grumbling or arguing, just giving an example of how we can do that. But why? So that we might become blameless, so that we might become children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Verse 16, then you will be able to boast on the day of Christ. Then you will shine among them like stars. In other words, as we abide in Christ, other people see Jesus in us. We shine among them like stars and the nation. And then we'll also be able to boast on the day of Christ. So do you see, this salvation isn't as a result of our works. Our salvation shines our works in Jesus to other people because we want to abide in him as a result of humbling our hearts. And so Paul says he's glad. Why is Paul glad? Because the Philippians are working out their salvation. They are working for Jesus, and Paul is glad with that. Remember, Paul's writing to the people of God in Philippi, the church of God in Philippi, and he's saying, as a result of imitating Christ's humility, humble your hearts and obey God in all you're doing. As you have been doing, continue to do that. Continue to work out your salvation. And thus Paul is glad, and we should be glad. So the therefore for us here in verse 12, as we imitate Christ's humility, is that as we experience joy and humility, we should also experience joy and obedience. You see, Paul doesn't see obedience as a negative thing. He says, then I'll be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labour in vain. You see, Paul sees obeying Christ as the biggest joy that he can do, because it means that his labour won't be in vain. He'll be able to boast on the day of Christ. And we too will be able to boast on the day of Christ if we live in abiding in Jesus as a result of humbling our hearts, imitating Christ's humility. So in verses 1 to 11 we had joy in humility, and here in verses 12 to 18 we have joy in obedience. And next time we're going to look at verses 19 to 30, where we're actually going to go back to joy in humility, but we're going to see two other examples in Timothy and Epaphroditus of what imitating Christ's humility looks like. So join us next time, where we'll be looking from Philippians chapter 2 verse 19 onwards. Otherwise, thanks for tuning in today. Great to be with you guys. Take care and God bless.